Good evening and welcome to all. So thank you all for joining our conversation on Environmental Impact Assessment 2020, Facts, Politics and Beyond. The debate between environmental conservation and development has been from the time when the whole environmental politics and the discussion in a global sphere has started. And environmental impact assessment stands central to this debate. The position of environmental impact assessment and environmental conservation and also the development is quite more pressing to the developing and the least developed countries because the countries of LTCs and the developing countries face a double burden issue where the poverty and the threats of the global environmental degradation hits both together. To achieve development as we know today, it is the industrial expansion is a need of the hour, but we are not at the luxury like the global West, who had the industrial revolution to pull out every one of their masses from their poverty. Sadly, with with the climate change and the global environmental issues progressing, which is even one that we are facing right now with the pandemic, conservation is important, and so is development. It is in between these two that environmental impact assessment stands as a tool that safeguards a minimum safeguard that can have and support development without compromising environment. But the question is how and what should be the terms. So to have this conversation along with us, we have our esteemed panelists. We have Shyama Kuriakose from Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, Advocate Maitri Hegde, Advocate of Kerala High Court and Supreme Court, and also none other than Nitin Sethi. So we do have a webinar platform, but we've chosen this platform of an open meeting because we need this issue is so pressing and important that we need an active participation from every one of you. So once the panel is open to the participants, I request that everybody participates actively, and I hope that the language wouldn't be a barrier, and we'll try to communicate. Even if you want to do it in a vernacular language, we'll try to communicate and translate as much as possible. So without any further delay, I would like Shyama Kuriakose to kick off the conversation. Over to you, Shyama. Thank you.
Thank you, Srinath, and thank you for inviting me for this event. And as you rightly said, this is quite a pressing issue, and it's a pressing time also where we need to come with decisions quick and fast. I'm coming from Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, and our environment team has been looking into this question of conservation versus development. Like, how do we create that balance through the tool of law, and how to improve and make better laws? So the points that I'll be making today would be streamlined towards that, like as to how law can help as a tool for improving governance, both in conservation and development. In fact, the points that I'm now sharing are basically the inputs that we shared with the ministry as comments to the EIA draft of 2020. I'm just sharing my screen. Please be patient. So yeah, basically we'll be talking about how to have a EIA regime which is more effective, because it's established that we need it. So before that, let's look at what's the state of environment in India. Like, Indian government has a penchant for creating new laws. So at the current rate, I'm thinking there are more than 500 statutes in India with regard to environment, both at the central and state level. So we have more than enough laws on environment to conserve the environment. And despite this extensive legal framework, we are ranking 168 out of 180 countries as per the 2020 ranking. And this has been conducted by none other than Yale Center for Environment Law and Policy. So this actually is a very sad plight. In fact, we have come down in our ranking as years have progressed. The ranking was done on various indicators, and some of them are here. Like, for instance, lack of sustainable solutions to growth, depleting air and water qualities, biodiversity loss. Like, these are some of the few criteria based on which we were judged, and it's quite poor. Throw into this mix the draft EIA of 2020. So like, if we have these kind of problems, then how is this draft helping us? So as we look at this draft, we realize that, before we do that, why don't we do an assessment? Like, for instance, this is environment impact assessment. Has anybody ever done a legislative impact assessment of the 500, more than 500 odd statutes in India? Has their assessment been done? Has there been a cost benefit analysis as to why, how, why are they not working? I mean, have these questions been really raised? So we decided that let's do a LIA of the EIA and see what comes up. And for this, we are looking at the environmental rule of law report by UNEP, which had created a few elements of rule of law, specifically environmental rule of law. Now, what are these elements of environment rule of law? Firstly, that the framework must be fair and unambiguous. That is, there should be no doubt as to what the law means to tell you. Secondly, there must be an easy access to information and justice, and it should allow for very good public facilitation, consultations, hearings. The third thing is accountability and integrity of all institutions and decision makers, as well as project proponents, must be very clear. I mean, it should rightly be there. Next is about their roles, like roles of all these stakeholders. How clear are we as to what their duties are? How are they supposed to perform? So there has to be some clarity on that. And obviously, in case of a dispute, it must be fair, timely, and everyone must be freely able to access these dispute resolution mechanisms. The next very important segment is about the relationship between the rights regime and environmental rule of law. Because as we know, environment is a very complex subject. So there are a multitude of rights that come within this frame. So how is this law helping with those rights, helping address those rights? I'll go into a little bit more detail. And lastly, of course, to establish a sound criteria for interpretation of environmental law. This is when you have to interpret it at the time of implementation. It can be either by the bureaucrats, or it can be by the courts, or it can be by any other stakeholder who's supposed to interpret this law. Coming to the rights aspect, the rights paradigm as we call it, because there are a lot of conflicts that I'll just explain. For instance, the first one of it is, the biggest one is the ecocentrism versus anthropocentrism, which is the right to environment versus the right of environment. As in the right of a human to what nature provides us and what the nature itself has by its right. And as we've seen, most of the laws that we right now have in India are more aligned towards anthropocentrism, which is for humans, as to how nature can work for humans. And there is a problem here, because then the needs of the nature gets ignored. The next paradigm or next dichotomy that we face is the right to environment versus right to livelihood. And we've seen that in a lot of projects, that where project proponents say that we are bringing more livelihood to these areas, whereas the right to environment or the healthy environment aspect is ignored. So which gets more significance in this? Right of industries to make profit versus rights of citizen to consume. This is another paradigm wherein in a city or in an area, industries are allowed to set up. On the other hand, there are citizens who are allowed to consume, who are allowed to drive vehicles, who are allowed to congest the cities or any other such landscapes. So there are these conflicting rights. Who has the higher right here? And this is now established that right to public health equals right to healthy environment. And this, even in this COVID situation itself, it was observed that regions and cities which are more polluted had a more higher disease burden. So it's important that the public health system should also be strong, and this will be aided by stronger environmental regimes. So now that we've done with the frame of environment rule of law, let's get into how the EIA regime came into India. It originated in 1970s as so impact assessments were supposed to be done for river valley projects at that time. But at that point, it was merely an administrative decision, and there was no law to back it up. And slowly this was expanded to any project that involves public investment. Then came the watershed movement in India in the 90s, where India has always been very proactive with its involvement in international conventions and treaties. So the Rio Convention and the climate change framework, which originated in the 92, India made a lot of obligations in those two conventions. Then we were struck by the Bhopal gas tragedy in 1986. So there was a fear of such a widespread tragedy due to industrial activity. And in the 90s, we also had the liberalization and industrialization era. So more and more industries are opening up, more and more investments were taking place. And this is also the most successful phase of Supreme Court judicial activism, as we call it, where courts were engaging more and more with the subject of environment. And it is at this time that the EIA draft, EIA notification came about in 1994. So it's important for us to understand this, this watershed moment. Has it changed now? Don't we have any such watersheds at this point? Is that why things are failing? So this is a little bit of a background. And now, once the 94 notification came, it underwent several changes. There were a lot of amendments that took place, and it depends from government to government. And it depends on a lot of vested interests. Implementation didn't get any better, but the law kept changing its form. There were a lot of cases that went to all the judicial forums, NGT, High Court, Supreme Courts, etc., which also set a trend of amendments in the EIA notification. Finally, it was superseded in 2006, and now we have the current draft of 2020. Right now, the project requiring EC is involving mining, thermal power plants, river valley, infrastructure, roads, highways, ports, harbors, and airports. So, like, there's a wide range of subjects. Starting from river valley projects, now we have come to this point. Now, when we look at the elements of environmental rule of law, and so like this is a very brief short comparison because there are a lot of technical opinions on the EIA draft which I would not want to get into. So this is like just a very basic comparison on whether the EIA draft is matching the environment rule of law elements. So the first thing is about being fair and unambiguous. Now this is supposed to be a law. Where is the preamble? What is the purpose of this law? Why do we have it? What is the basis of including projects within EIA assessment notification? Why do we need it? So every law has an introduction which is missing in this particular law. Now, when you come to the definitions, some of the definitions, for instance, project definition includes only the main project site. But what about additional components? Like if you're building some houses, like housing, shelter, or other infrastructure which are related to the main site, why are they not part of the project? Then distinctions have been created between like modernization and expansion, non-compliance and violation. These are terms which have been defined separately, but there are a lot of connections, a lot of overlaps between these definitions. So why are these distinctions there? So here we can say that it is ambiguous. Next is about public participation. And as we all know that a lot of projects, public consultations have been removed for those projects. And their feasibility will only be decided by the regulatory authority. This can have room for arbitrariness. Then when you look at accountability, half-yearly compliance report has been now made into yearly compliance reports. And this, given the past record of non-compliance, this messes with accountability. I mean, we have not been complying before. What guarantees are that people will comply now? Like, and what is the basis for setting this criteria? Then there are various committees which are created under the EIA. For instance, the Environment Appraisal Committee, the Environment Impact Assessment Authority, the Expert Appraisal Committee. All their qualifications are similar. But in the law, there is a hierarchy. So how is it that these laws, how are these committees having the same kind of members or same qualifications? So that's not clear. The dispute resolution mechanism is one of the most screaming point, which is the locus of persons, people who can complain against non-compliance has been really restricted to project proponent or by the government or by the committees. Which project proponent is going to complain that I have gone wrong? Who does that? So this particular provision is affecting the constitutional and legal right of a citizen to complain against development projects. Interpretation of law is the last thing, and here a lot of projects have been shifted from from category to category. What is the rationale for this, and how do we interpret it later? And that's going to create it's going to be a mine of problems when finally comes to adjudication. So these are some of the major ways in which we can see that the EIA draft is not really complying with the environment rule of law. Some other general criticisms that we have is about how it's not in tune with various international principles. Like the compensation and penalty aspect is so negligible that the destruction that occurs cannot be corrected by those amounts. And so it's violative of precautionary and polluter pays principle. The principle of non-regression, which has been endorsed by NGT and some international bodies, that is, a law must progress forward and not backwards. This particular draft is going against that norm by diluting a lot of the stringent provisions that were earlier there. And access to environmental information is also it has been said in the CBD, the Convention for Biodiversity, the United Framework for Climate Change. All these talk about how a citizen must have free access to environmental information in order to facilitate participatory decision making. And this is also completely ignored in this draft. There are also administrative hurdles which must be pointed out. For instance, how is the manpower and funding issues being resolved? As per a CAG report of 2017, it said that there were only 15 scientists available for monitoring of EC conditions against the sanctioned strength of 41. Regional offices are not delegated, and you have to report directly to the ministry for every small issue of compliance. The PCB and Pollution Control Committee responsibilities are not clear, and many of these PCBs were found to not have sufficient infrastructure and manpower, and these were reported in 2017. So it's not that old, it's very recent. How is the draft EIA trying to address these issues? So the other thing is that this is also an executive instrument. I think even Mr. Jairam Ramesh has also mentioned it about how this EIA draft is an executive instrument posing as a delegated legislation. So it makes it very easy for the government to tinker with it as and when they like. There is nothing steadfast. I know a law needs to be dynamic and flexible, but this law is just too dynamic and too flexible.
Shama,
Yeah.
sorry, if you could just come to
yeah. I'm just coming to the end.
Yeah.
So we are recommending that a standalone statute on EIA is the need of the hour. And then there'll be what is the cost of a poor EIA regime, and we can see that increase in poverty, rise in diseases, threat to food and water security. I mean, these are issues that we already know as the problems of environmental degradation. And here is the most important part. So there's a real connection between EIA, having an EIA, and sustainable development. As a developing country, as we achieve sustainable development, it's important that you understand the connection between the two. And not doing anything will ultimately result in a loss of 5% of global income. So it's time for us to act. And the true implications of sustainable development is not development. It's about it's very holistic. It's about changing consumption patterns. It's making sure that the poor do not suffer. It's about strengthening resilience of complex systems, landscapes, cultures, governance, and it's to avoid depletion of resources, especially food and water, which is our lifeblood, and it's to improve people's health and welfare. So to conclude, I can just say that a balance needs to be struck between ecology, economy, and equality. That is the only way forward, and EIA done properly, effectively, and holistically can probably help towards this cause. And not doing so, the cost will be massive. Thank you.
Thank you, Shama, for giving us a backgrounder on everything. You're giving a very holistic summary of the whole situation that we are in. I would request now Maitri to give her opening remarks. Over to you, Maitri.
Good evening. I'm actually overwhelmed in a sense that I'm sharing a panel with such erudite persons, and then I'm lucky. I consider myself to be lucky, to be part of this panel. So I hope I'll do justice to the panel. So before I start, one confession to be made that I'm a misanthropist, right? I strongly believe that the human species do not, it does not add value. It does not add any value to the environment. This is a confession. So I strongly believe that that the human species, without human species, the environment and the world would have been much happier and calmer. So with that confession, I'm coming to EIA 2020 draft. So already Shama has already explained the basics, how EIA is lacking the basic tenets of environmental rule of law. I would just like to add one more addition which I wanted to highlight otherwise also. Even the industries which require public consultation otherwise, one clause was actually shocking. There's this clause 8 in clause 14. I may just read that clause. Give me a minute, because it was, when I was going through the draft, it sort of, just a minute. Yes. So this says, if the public agency or authority nominated under the subclause 7 above reports the regulatory authority concerned that, owing to the local situation, it is not possible to conduct the public hearing in a manner which will enable the views of concerned local persons to be freely expressed. Say, I may pause here, a situation where there are some protests are happening, widespread protests are happening. This actually can come into this bracket. And then it reads, it shall report the facts in detail to the concerned regulatory authority, which may, after due consideration of the report and other reliable information that it may have, decide the public consultation in the case need not include the public hearing or not. So this is such, it was such a shock, even I did not expect that even in the cases where there is requirement of public hearing, public consultation, the government can decide based on the situation that whether the public hearing, the public consultation, whether that can be included in public hearing or not. So, that actually hits the root of the public consultation process. So that is one major problem then I'm just supplementing to what Shama said. And then, of course, when I was just thinking, how can I actually contribute to this discussion? So I think that the EIA draft, or even maybe the CRZ notification which came in 2018, which relaxed much restraints on the coastal development regulations. So this lack of having any environment philosophy, right? Even for courts, there is no, though we have developed the doctrines like precautionary principles, public trust doctrine, etc. There is no framework as such we have for developing our environmental laws. There is lack of fundamental environmental philosophy for us. So I'm not advocating for a blanket philosophy for entire India, but it should be regional, decentralized environmental philosophy. Why I say this? I had a case where I was appearing for farmers in a case of Palakkad. So the Malampura Dam, the largest dam of Kerala. So there, the dam was built, displacing so many farmers, promising the irrigation projects, and they were displaced. They were given rehabilitated lands, and then they were made to do paddy cultivation. And then then there is this Kinfra knowledge park is coming, and as soon as the knowledge park comes, there's this depletion of water supply to the farmers. So in the earlier year, in 2013 or so, it was 100 years, and then it comes to 65 days next year, and then it comes to 27 days. So in this case in particular, even the court had, you know, the its own limitations. I'll just go to the limitations of the courts even. So in that case specifically, what had actually happened is, it was not just about farmers, it was about the paddy cultivation. It was also about the conservation of paddy lands. We have Kerala Paddy Land Conservation Act here. So you are not letting the farmers to do the cultivation, and also on the other hand, you are saying there cannot be conversion. And this is how the the setup of development which is going on. I can give some 100 cases like this, where this dichotomy of development and environment conservation is just spreading across different statutes, in lying before different courts without any framework. So we lack environmental philosophy, basic philosophy, because of which this all, all this scattered kind of disputes arise, and the courts also become helpless. And then there was this one case where it was challenging the construction of a resort. So what happened is, the panchayat gave building permission that had to be challenged, and also the environmental pollution clearance, and then that the dam safety authority, it was near the dam, so dam safety authority had also given clearance. So what actually court did is, court asked the petitioners to go to each respective authority, that is the appellate authority of the panchayat, local self-governance body, and then the appellate authority of the dam safety authority, and then the environmental clearance board. So this different authorities the petitioner had to approach to get to get the results. These are the practical difficulties lawyers also face when it comes to environmental cases. And then in composite, if you may ask, then a composite forum is already given, that is National Green Tribunal. So if you ask about the status of National Green Tribunal, in 2007 there were five benches which were functioning. Now in 2020 it has come to 2 benches, that one in Delhi and one in Chennai. There are no circuit benches anymore working because there is no appointments. I don't know if I'm derailing, I'll just draw parallel, that is National Company Law Tribunal is actually come in 2013, and there are 11 benches. The appointments are happening in full speed. So it just shows the priorities. So what I was trying to say is that the courts will have limitations when it comes to even in in a limited sense, the courts are definitely interfering, but the courts will have interference because of this practical difficulties. So in order to even then yes, I would definitely want to draw attention to the importance of the limitation of the courts, because that's how you actually get enforced your rights. So because of the court's limitations, and because of the because of not having an environmental philosophy, this entire regime has become entirely complex. So another issue I wanted to bring into light, why am I speaking about this environmental philosophy so much? There is this one paper I actually came across, that is Victor B. Flatt's paper on the NEPA's setup, that is Environmental Impact Association Assessment setup in US. So there, in that context, he had actually advocated that environmental risk allocation and environmental philosophy should form part of impact assessment. So what I mean by this is, say there are studies in coal mines wherever happening. So the people surrounding, the people who are living in the surrounding places, there is increase of death of such people while because of the air pollution, the diseases in connection with air pollution. So that is definitely should be included in the risk evaluation of environment impact assessment. That is what actually Victor advocated. So that what I'm trying to say is that those kind of values, right, the risk evaluation and the principles which are there, which are forming the part of customary practices in specific places, right? For example, you have Nagabana and Devrakanu and these kind of small forest patches in I find this practice in Kerala as well as in Karnataka. I'm not sure of the other places, where you will have to actually reserve such forest patches to a specific deity, and you're not allowed to go inside the place, and only during specified ritualistic days you are allowed to go inside, and then do a limited level of that. You cannot build temples, you cannot have a big festivals. So that kind of customary practices are there. Those customary practices plus this risk evaluations should be included in EIA, or it should be included in the entire environmental regime which we have. When we have these kind of basic tenets for each geographical situations, then even it will be easy for the courts to decide, because when the disputes are when the principles are decentralized and the regional specific principles do come into play, the awareness among the persons will also consequently increase, and then the persons will easily access, or at least that is the hope, that there will be certain limited minimum guaranteed awareness among the people, which will drive them to court if there are violations. And then the courts will also have an effective tool to deal with these kind of situations. Now what has happened is, now the environmental, though there are environmental laws which are in place, though there are violations, you have different kind of principles, legal principles, which are playing the field. For example, equity. There are so many cases where we see the Supreme Court says that post facto approval is bad, but because you have already built the you have already built the factories, you have already invested, so you pay 10 crore. I just came across this decision which has happened in February 2020. So it actually directed the violating factories to pay 10 crore fine, and then to go ahead with the affairs of the factories. So what it completely, because all these legal principles which are also playing the field, it becomes it becomes sort of it becomes subjective to the understanding and the commitment of the judges as well, whether to give permission, whether to allow this violations to perpetuate or not. So what so this concluding, I'm just concluding with this thing, that development and environment protection, that eternal debate, is we are looking is that we are looking with a perception of what already with a prejudiced mind as to what is development. I'm saying our understanding of development has to change. There has to be a paradigm shift from what we understand as development. So this one tiger on tiger conservation, there's this study made by Indian Institute of Forest Management. So they say per rupee return of rupees 347 to rupees 7,488 rupees you will get per rupee return on conservation of tigers. At the same time, the governments are not willing to build underway paths in the tiger belts, saying that it is expensive. So even when you look at economic impact, when you study systematically the economic impact, the tiger conservation is more beneficial, is more economical than the than building a highway right into the tiger belts. So yes,
Maitri?
I'm just yeah. So what
Sorry.
I'm trying to say is that development is not what we are actually being taught. We will have to think twice whether is that development which, you know, it is it really our development which is taking place. So we will have to rethink what is being taught as development. We will have to change the definition of development. Then only as a developing country we can actually truly reach developed state. That's what I'm trying to say. Thank you. I don't know if I made sense. Yeah.
You definitely did, Maitri. Thank you so much for that spirited conversation and bringing in the practical issues that we have in ground. Now, I would like to call upon Nitin Sethi to give his opening remarks. Over to you, Nitin.
Thank you so much for having me for this. I think the two previous speakers have kind of covered entire ground. At best, I'll try and plug small holes if there were any that they left for me to do so. Let me try and step back and say, I'm a journalist. As a practicing journalist, you see the political economy of any policy operating more closely than you see the larger principles at play. So a few facts that we must remember before in which we can perhaps have this conversation in context. One, as I think Shyama rightly pointed out, we must remember that our environmental laws largely came about in the pre-liberalization era. They came about as a response to certain crises at certain times. Say the Environment Protection Act as a response to the Bhopal tragedy, as Shyama pointed out, the Forest Conservation Act as a response to the increase of agriculture cutting into forest land that brought the 1980 Forest Conservation Act. And post-stabilization, we've had what Shyama, I think, and Maitri hinted at and Shyama spoke about. We've had a set of changes brought into these laws by what are called subordinate legislation processes, which are basically notification that a government can pass on its own without actually going through, at least in the practice of it, through a legal parliamentary approval process. It has to table these notifications within the parliament, but it does not seek an approval from them. So since about 1997, the entire nature of environmental governance, with rare exceptions like the creation of NGT and the Forest Rights Act, has been governed by executive orders of various kinds. And therefore, we've seen these orders being reversed constantly, amended constantly, sometimes for good, sometimes a lot of times for diluting what industries wanted and stabilizing them. We've also seen something which is a trend that has stood out since, I would think, if I remember my data correctly, since about 2004, 2003, is that if I, as a project proponent, I want to develop some, say, a real estate project or want to set up a coal plant or a steel plant, if we as developers went to the government for environmental clearance, and let's think of this clearance as maybe a license, that we went to the government seeking this environmental license, then in 98% of the times, the government will eventually give it to us. Now, and this has been true in the previous UPA regime. This has also been true in the last 6 years of the current government. Now, that might make you wonder and say, then why is the industry so pissed off with the environmental laws? If 98% of the projects eventually get cleared, then they should be pretty happy. I mean, I would be as an industrialist pretty happy. But the key phrase is eventually. Most of the corruption that is practiced in governments is not by withholding clearances and licenses perpetually, but by holding them temporarily till a down payment is made to somebody or the other. Now, this was the problem that existed in the UPA regime. Undoubtedly, we heard stories about it. It clearly continues to be the case also in this government, except you hear a little less because we journalists feel more emasculated and scared to write about it than we did in the previous regime. The fact is that if industry after 6 years of this government is still saying that there's something wrong with this law, this is still not good enough. It is not asking for a 99.99% clearance rate. 98% should be good enough. What is asking for is clarity. What is asking for is a lack of discretion which a bureaucrat or a politician or a government can use to blackmail and earn what in economic terms is called rent seeking, but to put it in plain English, it's corruption at the highest levels, what we call crony capitalism, so to say. Now, we must also believe that in a country like ours, or any country, society for that matter, there will always be good businesses. There'll always be certain businesses that want to cut a shortcut and make a quick buck. Just like in any segments of society, there's always a good set of businessmen wanting to play by the rules if the rules are fair. Now, what a bad discretionary process does is favor the bad guys against the good guys, even within industry. Now, at the same time, if you look at this process of 10 years of 15 years of clearances being given through this discretionary process, you'll also find that the levels, I think Shyama referred to it, Maitri referred to it, that the levels of environment, quality of environment in India has also deteriorated at the same time. So if you look at both sides of the picture, neither the industry nor the environment has gained from a discretionary process that existed so far. It's been a license seeking process. It's been a discretionary corruption ingrained process. At times we hear more of it than the others, but that's been a consistency of the environmental law in India in its practice. As Shyama said, there are 500 different laws, but each of them, when they end up as a license process, they land up in this position. Now, against this backdrop, I would step back and imagine, obviously, we do need an environment clearance process which assesses the impact of a project on our environment. And let's not fool ourselves, every development activity will have a trade-off. There will be an economic advantage gained for some. There will be a fallout on your nearby or larger environment of that industrial or development activity. The job of an environment clearance system is to minimize that and make sure it never reaches a debilitating levels where lives are disturbed to the point that they are irretrievable or damaged to the point that life deteriorates. Now, a good system of environment clearance, therefore, to my mind, would have these 2 or 3 principles in place to follow. 1, it is based on science. 2, it is not based on discretion, but on a set of rules and laws. And 3, and of utmost important, that it is built on complete transparency where anyone who takes a decisions, and these are tough political decisions. I will not say a politician's job clearing a project is very easy. He or she has to deal with the fact that a coal power plant is required for your energy. He or she also has to deal with the fact that when you have it, you will also have pollution in your backyard. But when he or she takes this decision, because it is being taken by a servant of the people, that decision-making process is absolutely transparent and available for us to review at the time of the decision-making and post facto once the decision has been made. And 3, and the last thing, where you have a mechanism which is as transparent, reviewing whether the conditions and the terms under which you allowed certain activity to occur, whether those terms and conditions were followed or not. 4th, obviously, is a judicial process. In case somebody does bad, what do you do with them? Now, if we step back and say this environmental clearance process so far has more or less not functioned along these lines. It's functioned to a discretionary level where a minister or a bureaucrat sitting in a small room in Delhi or in a capital in a state can largely clear whatever they want. There is a process of public consultation, but we remember the word is consultation. There is no consent. So you and I, if somebody was building a coal power plant in my backyard, I might be consulted on paper, said, do you like it? And I might say, I may not like it because I feel I'll suffer from the coal pollution. But at the end of the day, the decision relies entirely on the hands of a few bureaucrats, and therefore the minister and the government in charge to do whatever they want. I have no say thereafter except to go to courts, and unlike what some, I think, practicing lawyers may not be able to say, perhaps, I have the legit space to say that the judicial system in our on the jurisprudence on environment has been pretty much as horrible as the government itself. It has had sporadic good judgments, which even it has not rigorously followed in other cases when it needed to. So this is what we've had. Now, what does the EIA 2020 suggest to us? If you look at the preamble, a couple of paragraphs, it seems pretty much okay. They say industry should have a quick clearance system. At least I feel there's no problem in it. An industry that wants to set up a shop should as quickly and legitimately as quickly as possible get a yes or no. It should not be hanging around ministries and ministers' rooms and their PAs and their assistants saying, sir, file, please move my file. Very clearly, they should get a clarity in the limited amount of time available to them. Two, that the EIA 2020 says that we are also trying to rationalize the process by which we give clearance, because certain projects, are not so big and they should get clearance default. They should not go through a very rigorous process, which to my mind principally is fine. You cannot think a welding shop is the same as a steel power plant or a steel plant or a power plant. They should have different degrees of rigorousness. But what is the basis on which you decide whether a plant is going to be dangerous for the environment or a higher risk than the other? Now, in this EIA 2020, it makes the size of the investment a key criteria rather than the pollution load that an industry might provide. Now, I might have a uranium plant or uranium digging plant, which actually, if I remember, the biggest one in Andhra Pradesh, roughly costs only about 500 crores a year of operation in contracts. Yet, a bad spill out from there, as we all know, could be much worse than a 2,000 crore steel power plant, a steel plant or a power plant somewhere. So the criteria by which you judge a project to be more debilitating or risky for environment cannot be investment size. Now, if I take it as investment size, what happens? Clearly, I'm saying the big guys get away easy. The bigger the investment, the less I would be worried about it, because big money is there. The criteria cannot be that. The criteria has to be purely environmental standards. Now, the standards themselves, as Shyama and Maitri themselves were pointing out, I think very well, that how do you set up standards? The standards are the critical cogs by which you decide. Say in a class, a teacher says, here I'm giving an exam. This is the criteria by which you'll get grade A, B, C. Now, if I, as a teacher, can turn around and every second day change the criteria, I'm clearly playing a dirty game. In this case, the government for years has done this, that on its whim and fancy, any day that it wants, it can change the criteria and the standards after saying we've consulted people, but more or less doing it on their own. Here, the EIA 2020 actually solidifies this entire process of the notification of standards being a discretion of the government. At any juncture, it can change it to whichever it wants. It can say this one will go through a rigorous process, this one will not. Tomorrow, if another bad industrialist came to it and said, no, I want this easy, it could dilute that as well. Now, this brings me to the large principle point that what does this EIA 2020 really do for us? It is the only option, and I must emphasize, it is the only option where the citizens at least get to sit on the side of a sea and watch how the waves are coming. They do not even get onto a boat and enjoy the sea. They just sit on the side and see how the government is clearing a project and how it's assessing the value of a project for society. Now, if you diminish the space for the public and the citizen, you are saying the government is all powerful. It is not my civic servant. It is actually my Lord which will decide everything for me. To me, the standard themselves you can tweak. I can ask for 450 ppm higher or a 450 ppm lower standard for air pollution for a certain chemical. But the entire base principle that this will be done in full public view with full public consultation at all stages. We had a notion of it, and this EIA 2020 dilutes it yet further, makes that even notion slip away in many cases. Again, I think Srinath pointed this out, and we must remember this. Are we such a horrible country? We keep on complaining as citizens. I think it's our right to complain, to ask for better. But if you step back and looked at the world at large and how it economically developed, at early stages of industrialization, most of Northern Europe had an easy opportunity to develop without having the constraints of these standards of either environment or labor. It was almost free for all. As it developed over time, as the per capita income in these countries increased, they started also evolving better standards and law, at least for themselves. Even if they didn't do that for the rest of the world, for themselves they did. But these countries also had a great advantage which we don't have. The second advantage they had, that they were capturing the natural resources from the rest of the world to push into their own industrialization. The raw material for their growth, the energy sources, the raw material came from the rest of the world, from Asia and Africa. Now that era is over, and thankfully so, because that's what led to slavery and many other problems. India does not do it to that extent. It tries its hands on its neighbors and a few other countries that it thinks it can push over, but largely that era is over. Now, what does that mean? It means every time I do an industrial project, say, which needs bauxite to build aluminium, I am digging the ground under my own feet. I am not even digging the feet under somebody else's citizens. Every trade-off is a trade-off that is built on my life and your life as a citizen. Therefore, the risks of getting this wrong are much higher than they were for Europe or US at some point. Therefore, the trade-offs are much more difficult. Therefore, the transparency of these rules is essential. It may not have been for an average American then when they were sourcing oil from the Middle East, but it will be for us when we dig out coal from under the feet of our tribal population, which are anyway historically the least privileged amongst us. It will always be more difficult if we want to build hydroelectricity dams in the Northeast, in areas where our citizens already feel much more deprived and feel like second-grade citizens compared to us. Therefore, for us at this juncture, and Shyama again used that word right, that as you grow as an economy, the ability should be to improve your standards, not regress from what you had. And you do not do it under standards set by international community. I think we are now a powerful enough country to set standards for our own selves. I think we cannot be foolish enough in that name to say, because we want to grow and we do not want to follow a standard that the Europeans set, I will allow 5,000 more people to die early because of air pollution in Delhi. Or I will subjugate the lives of tribals in India for the sake of a strange growth which does not actually help them at all. Now, while the large debates of environment and development will continue, I think they're healthy debates. At all times, these tensions should exist and will exist, and people will negotiate it out. To my mind, and I'll end with this, the environment impact assessment process is a small little nail we had in the wall, which allowed us to hook at least the notion of environment in our lives. Right now, we're plugging it out. And in this, I don't see there's any great debate about environment and development. This is purely government seeking to get a greater centralized control on license giving to industries. This is a political discretionary system being built that will reduce our oversight over the system. It will reduce bureaucratic discretion, I agree, but it will increase the discretion in the hands of the political class. And it might be this government today, it would be another government tomorrow, and none of them will be any different in this count, I believe. One might be 10% more than the other, but you will have a complete political discretion system which is legally legitimized. And the consequences of that you will not see on the environment alone. You will see on the entire political economy, because these are the kind of corrupt licensing mechanisms that then feed into corrupt electoral elections, electoral processes. Therefore, you have things like electoral bonds. Therefore, you have large corporates funding political parties discreetly without us knowing, where we end up with standing with a single vote, and large corporates can get away by influencing policy without our knowledge. So I think this is a symptom of a very bad electoral and a democratic process. It's not just an environmental issue. It's an issue of civic rights of citizens. And I'll stop with that for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Nitin, for that. It was, I'm really moved. Without any further ado, let's move into the discussion. So I would like to pose my first question to all the panelists, because as Nitin was rightly saying, that all the laws that was there was before liberalization, and it is the post-liberalization process, or the challenges were met from time to time in an ad hoc manner. But if you look into our, I understand that the laws built from what we as a society is. We understand that India as a society as a whole is a very pro-environment, is a is a community that lives very close to the nature. So, but from where does that the change begin? Was it from the time when after the independence that we decided to go towards a heavy industry model, or was it, or is it later, or what actually changed even in a political manner, in a legal manner? From where do you think that change has happened? So that is my first question. And the second question that I would like to raise with the panelists is, uh, the differentiation is something that has we can see when we compare with every other EIA legislations, be it US or with Europe. We see that differentiation does happen. For instance, if I'm not wrong, in US in NEPA, which there are certain provisions where exemptions were given. So how is it that the exceptions that we have over here different, or is it that the standards that we follow that is different? Yeah. Thank you. It's open to anybody to take in.
Nitin, you'd like to?
Okay, let me try. I'm so verbose, I'm scared of myself at times. Okay. You have two questions and I'll quickly try and answer both, Srinath. I don't think we were, this notion that at some point Indian society was living in close relation with environment, I think is half fiction. The fact is, the caste system itself reflects how resources were cornered by a such bunch of elites on an institutional basis, segregating others in the name of caste from those resources. I think those battles continue regardless of the kind of laws we have. We've still not thrown away that horrible system of what I think is economic slavery, which takes away access to resources from tribals and scheduled castes in our history. Now, what's happened on top of that is you've built a nation state built on that caste system, which is exploitative in its own way. It's never been reformed beyond the principles set in the constitution. It's never reformed. And it's particularly taken a setback when you had a new player on the game, which was post-industrialization that you rightly point out. Industrialization did bring capital in the hand of a new set of people in a fashion that it didn't exist earlier. It leveraged a new space, but our regulatory systems did not catch up with that process. And this is not true just for environment. I think it's true for across the boards. Our regulators pre-liberalization continue to be morphed gently and slowly to try and regulate this new behemoth. We've not been able to do that. We've not been able to create new independent regulators. To give you an example, in the environmental regime itself, the environment impact report for a project developer, say if I am the steel plant manager, I pay the consultant to make the report for me. Now, clearly, I cannot imagine that he or she would make it against me because I'm paying it. So this is the kind of regulatory systems we've done. There's been regulatory capture on a structural basis in some cases. Two, on your question of exemptions and trade-offs and differentiation between what's required for development and what's not at different stages. These things will change. In the 60s and 70s, if we wanted governments to build steel plants, I think now we are looking at private sector coming in to build steel plants, aluminum plants, etc. Therefore, the standards will also keep evolving as our ethics evolve over time. The question is not of the exemption per se to my mind. It is of having a complete transparency about who gets this exemption and on what basis. That there is no discretion in granting exemption. You cannot say that an X plant can come on the East Coast, but the same plant by another company cannot come on the Y Coast because of other reasons. If you have a rule-based system, as Shyama was saying, I'm quite happy with. I can contest and ask for better standards every 2 years. But as long there's a transparent mechanism, what we have is an extremely opaque mechanism. I don't think US EPA is brilliant, but it's better than us. And there is something to learn from that society. There is something to learn from all other governmental regimes. I think there are only 2 countries in the world, somebody was telling me the other day, which does not have an EIA. One of them is Singapore and the other is Sierra Leone. We are now tending to go towards a point where we legally have a very thin slice of pretense to having an EIA. To me, that is very scary.
If I may add to what Nitin is saying, basically, we haven't changed our system from when it used to be. Like, if you talk about history, and of course, I'm not an expert in it, but the basic understanding of environmental regime across history, if you look at it, there have been various colonial regimes that have come into India, and then there's been the ones before. So we may have had some texts on conservation, but then all of that got derided the moment there were colonial expansionist regimes inside the country. And the British Empire was the last one. And if you look at laws that we have now, or the regulators that we have now, the Babu system, it is similar to what we had then. Like there is, like right now, we just have a lot of brown Babus who are making these decisions. If you look at the Forest Act, it is pre-independence, 1927, and the forest, the system of using forest as a produce has not changed over time, even though we're talking about forest conservation. So, I mean, this has to change, this has to evolve to what we have now. And to that extent, there's a lot of lessons that we can take from the developed countries which have realized their mistakes, and now they're proceeding towards a more just and equitable society, a bit more oriented towards conservation. So there are lessons to learn, and we cannot dwell on the past saying that, you know, we were so great and now what happened. Let's move on. Yeah.
I actually stand a little different here. So when I see back the or you were asking, you know, the period pre-liberalization, or even going back to the when I was mentioning about some customary practices. So maybe because of the fear of God, maybe because of illiteracy, maybe because of lack of knowledge, maybe because of lack of resources and science, I think there were forest patches which were, you know, simply hanging on the beliefs. Okay, it was not just about the fear of God, or I'm not ascribing some higher values to this customary practices. I'm just pointing out the fact that an entire it's you know, it includes many elements. It's people were not really knowing about the science, they did not have money. So as I mentioned, there were customary practices which were actually keeping the environment in a better manner than now. But now, or at least you can say, at least people used to believe that, though they did not practice or there were aberrations, people at least believed that, you know, going to this Nagban will affect my future or my life. Or there were, even now there are these forest patches. So these actually got diminished, or the views of people got changing, both because of our advancement of science, and also because of Sanskritization. An interesting article I read of Adira Paranchiri before some 2 years. It was about how this tribal deities are being built temples. You know, there has been Sanskritization is happening. So even to that matter, if you ask me, Sabrimala, it's a such controversial temple. It was in a very small place among, you know, inside the temple. Now because of Sanskritization, you know, it has become such a big temple, and, you know, attracting so many people. And then now it has become the center of controversy, and then you have so many people rushing in. Then there will be you know, it is in right within the tiger sanctuary. So these kind of Sanskritization, and also advancement of science, people no more believe, these tribal persons, families, they no more believe in their you know, Huli Devaru means tiger god. They don't know, they don't believe in their gods, and they just use this forest for their private purposes. So both ways, I think it is hampering our belief in environment. I'm not sure how far this extent or the impact of this belief, but this is what I've been seeing in my surroundings.
Thank you. So I think we'll take some questions from the participants for now. So the first question that was raised was by Sarvajit. Sarvajit, would you like to take the question?
Yeah. Since all the buzz is around this EIA draft 2020, but we are not seeing like the existing rules and regulations which are not getting followed in this NDA regime. Like for example, as per the Wildlife Protection Act, the forest clearance has to be cleared by National Board for Wildlife, which has to be headed by the Prime Minister. But in current regime, it is being done by the subordinate standing committee, which is headed by the MOEF minister, and it is not currently followed. What is the rules and regulations there? So why like this violation is getting like we are not talking about this kinds of violation? So that is my question. Thank you.
Panelists, so shall I take the questions together and you'll get the answer? Shall I do that?
Yeah, makes sense. Maybe bunch a couple of questions
Yeah.
together.
Okay. Yeah, we have a question from Vanisri. Hello.
Hari Om. It is just a comment and a small question. To the question of Sethi sir, whether we are an irresponsible country, the Ridhima Pandey versus Union of India 2017 shows, her own understanding that science-based measure to combat climate action is the need of the hour is a positivity to us. But my question is, do you think that the draft EIA, as as Shama ma'am already said, the goal is not there in the preamble, whether the goal is a prerequisite for a loan from GEF, etc., and also whether EIA is looking at a managerial approach to managerial approach in the issue of environment to have a self-interest to the ease of doing business, because the strategic exception to mute the people's voice in a country which is lobbying for differentiated responsibility is really a paradox. Second question is, it also, the EIA draft also, whether it is reiterate that India's policy framework, especially on environment, is an aggregation of variety of uncoordinated sources in discrete areas such as pollution, water, energy, transport, along with environment clearance. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. So the next question is from Navamohan.
So my question would be, it's not actually a question, just a kind of interpretation or regarding section 14 and public consultation. Again, adding to what Shama ma'am and Maitreyi ma'am said, the section subclause B of clause 1 under section 14 actually says inviting responses in writing from other concerned persons having a plausible stake in the environmental aspects of the project, be it that or with further in that same section, there is said that further that in the projects under item 31 regarding pipelines, the public consultation shall be limited to the districts. So my question would be that why is there a geographical restriction among when public consultation happens? Say for example, there is a pipeline project near a national park or a wildlife sanctuary somewhere, and I am an expert in hydrology, and I want to express my view from Chennai to a project which is somewhere remote, in a remote village in say Bihar or Assam or somewhere. So won't this geographical restriction of public consultation not allow expression of right view of experts? So how can the experts who are not part of the government or not part of the environment clearance committee, how can they express their views regarding projects which may affect the environment negatively? Thank you.
So shall we take the answers and then go to the next bunch of questions? So the question by Sarvajit was the National Board for Wildlife hasn't met ever since 2014. So since all the decisions for the wildlife clearances are being taken by the standing committee instead of NBDWL for the wildlife clearances. So why such clearances, which happens to be a clear violation of law, does not even ring a buzz?
Yeah,
so
this has been the format for a while now, and wildlife clearances have also become a sham, the way it's being conducted. Even forget NBWL, even the State Board of Wildlife, which is supposed to meet, I mean, there are stipulations based on how often they should meet, and that very rarely happens. In fact, I was talking to a few members of such boards, and there is also a lot of influence from political vested interests on granting acceptance to certain projects and rejecting others. So they are facing that kind of pressure both at the state and central level. This is like the reality, and only very few people who are following these subject matters know that these developments are happening. Otherwise, you often miss them. So that's my response to that first one. Anybody else wants to add to that?
There is also this per which some website is being set up. So it gives the single board clearance, single window clearance for all this clearances, including the wildlife clearances, forest clearances. So a website, just a look at the website, it actually tells the online meetings, and then it just aims at the speeding the process, it just tries to expedite. So that is also another problem.
So yeah, so basically for the next question, it was regarding ease of doing business. And as it is clear, like, of course, this government has been touting that ease of doing business is our main priority. Like both central governments and even the state governments are following through. In fact, during the COVID crisis, we've noticed how the state governments have lumbered down on their labor regulations. They've made it more like less. I mean, you don't have to jump so many hoops now as regards labor regulations. So there is that focus on ease of doing business, and I think we also were quite impressed by our own increase in ranking at the international level. Like there was the World Bank performance index, and our ranking went up. So that also apparently is a motivator for why. I mean, I'm assuming that that's probably why these sort of laws, this EIA draft has been designed in such a way. But like we just said, or like Nitin sir said, like when there is discretion involved, or when there is centralization involved, I mean, where is the ease? There is still no ease even with this new law, because it's just as complicated as it was before. Yeah.
I just wanted to add an anecdotal data which tells us the nature. Somebody asked why the wildlife board is not meeting, nobody is doing anything about it. I think the first gentleman. If you look at the non-compliance of the environmental laws, forest or environment laws over the last 20 years, I'm not even saying this government, that government, over last 20 years. Now, the maximum fine, I think, in the Environment Protection Act, and Sharma will correct me, is I think 1 lakh rupees till date. And the maximum penalty is 3 to 7 lakhs for a gross violation. Now, in the last 20 years since liberalization, while the air, water, and land in our country has deteriorated, not a single officer, and this is without exception, not a single officer of the government taking these decisions, allowing this to happen, has ever gone to jail or even been fined. Now that tells us the kind of regulatory mechanism where we have, where if the same thing was to happen where, say, a corporate, large corporate's interest was hit by a maleficent officer, at least he or she would have got transferred out with a bad name attached, or a politician would have got involved in it. In the environment clearances regime, you have never seen the maximum fine of 1 lakh rupee that is allowed under the Environment Protection Act till date from the point of inception has never been imposed on anyone. And imagine this 1 lakh was set in 1986. So that 1 lakh has no value today. Even then, that fine has never been imposed either by the government or by a court process till date. That tells you the flagrant nature by which the political executive gets away in this government by having a notion of a law, but not actually practicing. So I'm not amazed, say in any of these clearances process, that discretion is used, illegalities happen and are then covered up and life moves on. There is a larger concept in the environment managing thing which we must consider. Any region, any eco-region, say Kerala for that matter, you take a small pocket. Kerala is an eco-sensitive region. It's a thin sliver of a belt of land. It's not a wide landscape. You have small resources, a very rich, verdant state, but a very small resource base. Now, if I wanted to set up 6 port projects in Kerala, I would have to imagine that this is the size of the coastline. What would be the overall impact of having 6 port projects as a collective on the area? Now, this process that we have today does a piecemeal clearance, saying one guy goes and gets a clearance for one port, the second guy goes and gets it for the second, and we're not looking at the cumulative impact. Now, in the ecological parlance, this is called the carrying capacity sense. Now, for any region, we would have a sense of carrying capacity of how much strain can it take before it breaks down. How much hydroelectricity power, how much road networks can it take before it starts to crumble? We don't have that. And we're even stepping further. There is a clear case to be made, I think I've said this for years, for a simpler clearance process. No industrialist should need to go to 10 bureaucrats and 10 environmental clearances in the states and center. They should ideally get one holistic clearance, which is well done. But why do people at this stage not trust the government to do that when it says it's looking for reform? Is because we see the past track record of this government for 6 years and the previous government for 10 years. And we say every time in the name of reform, it's always been a dilution here and a dilution there. So there is also a lack of civic trust in your government to respond to you rather than a few corporate interests in this case. And that fear sets us back long way than just this episode. It makes it difficult for even new governments that come in with maybe slightly better mandates or ideas to do it, because it will lack the trust of the people. And that to me is more scary than just this one EIA process.
Thank you. So I'll move on to the next set of questions. I request Nitin Ramakrishnan.
Hariom. So I just want to ask one question, because the discussion was regarding, regarding the impact assessment, public participation. How much simple is this thing, impact assessment? What is the capacity of a developing country? Forget India, probably take for example Africa or somewhere, countries. What is the capacity of those developing countries to conduct this assessment? What is the kind of resources needed for this assessment? How much is this understandable by the public? Because once I was involved in one particular discussion, what happened was there were two sets of people in the same locality. Both of them belongs to farming group, but they are not ready to accept one particular document. They are looking for three different types of document and the numbers in it. What is the kind of impact it could create, regarding the kind of what would be the water drawn, what would be the leveling down of water tables. All these things was not actually accepted by the people themselves. There was multiple groups accepting multiple numbers and having a discussion or a debate amongst themselves. And in India, I believe it's a too problematic thing because of our kind of politics which we have, which is very much involved in it. Most of the politicians get involved into these public groups as well. So I would like to know regarding what is EIA and how are we probably doing it?
So next question we have from Dr. Ria.
I actually have two questions. I'll just quickly state them out. First is that what sort of best practices can we take up from other emerging and populated economies, like for example China and Brazil? Because India, as much as we would want us to become a Norway or a Scandinavian country, because they are very popular for their environmental management, but we have the burden of ever increasing population and limited area and other complexities. So what sort of best practices can we take up from these two economies? And the second quick question is that since environment, I'm not sure if it is a state, it belongs in the state list, as I think, in the Indian Constitution. So do you think that also makes a difference? Because if the states do not have the power to make laws as per their own state complexities, then it becomes a very difficult issue to manage things. For example, in I'm speaking from Delhi. So in Delhi, we see every year there's this paddy residue burning issue, and it brings a host of health problems, and essentially it's an environmental issue. So I would really request your opinion as to how can that be addressed. Thank you.
Okay, next question we have from Nitin Kumar.
Yeah. So one of the main thing that we discussed here is with respect to transparency of legislation and transparency of the entire bureaucratic system itself. So one point which I would like to ask is standardization is one of the way to achieve transparency and to fight a corrupt regime at any manner. Does the provisions which provide for standardized terms of reference in EIA assessment increases transparency? That's one. I have one more question. Say, for example, if an industry or a company set up somewhere in Kerala has already secured and environmental clearance certificate after doing a positive EIA assessment, and then they start new expansion of their business, say that expansion is 25% or 30%. Should we again go through the entire EIA process, or can we do away with the requirements within, can we go ahead with how the EIA draft says? Will we agree that the current EIA draft will be okay in that situations?
Next question we have from Arundhati Sundar. Ma'am, could you come in?
Yeah, so I just wanted, Shyama had mentioned that the environmental philosophy that should form a basis for law has not been very clearly mentioned in this. So do you have a document which is Indian rather than an American putting a document out? Do you have a document that you may have prepared or other Indian on what kind of environmental philosophy should be the basis for which the law, on the basis of which the law has to be this? If you have such a document, it would be very helpful if you shared that. So that was one. And I also wanted to say something about what Maitri was talking about Devar cow and Sarpa cow and others. So this kind of sacred groves do exist and had existed in much, much greater extent all over India. So when I was in Himachal, there used to be a really absolutely wonderful space which had a tiny, like you said, village temple. Not really a temple, but a tiny kind of a place where the locals would go and put a little lamp over there, but nothing would be taken out from. There would be no kind of exploitation of that forest area. But the timber mafia kind of decimated that place, because when the locals kind of objected to the timber mafia going in to cut the forest or take things out of that forest, they really, I think maybe even a murder occurred by the timber mafia. And then the locals, the poor villagers who had been following their customs down the ages, absolutely, like they would not, they would all.
We are running short of
time. So I think so. What I'm trying to say is that what she's talking about is something that is applicable probably all over India to strengthen those practices by which people had managed to conserve their land and their resources, and in a way almost make it like a bank for environmental purpose. And to bring in laws that would strengthen such customs would be something that every villager, every tribal, every area people would know about and be able to be a participant in a very active manner. So I don't know whether you can address these things.
So with this, I think we are short of time, and so these would be the last set of questions. I would just like to comment in the earlier bunch. The question on section 14 was left out. If someone could comment, it would be nice. Thank you. Over to you guys. Thank you.
So if I may, so on section 14, yes, that gentleman is correct. Like when public hearing is restricted to a district, that does limit the purpose of it, because the impact of projects are not limited to that district. It can have a wider impact. So forget the fact of a person sitting in Chennai wanting to comment on something happening in Bhubaneswar, for instance. The district adjoining Bhubaneswar will be left out if this EIA draft comes into power. So this must be avoided, because this is why we're looking at a cumulative impact assessment, like impact of projects in a larger context than just the project site. So yeah, this provision is bad in law. And as regards, so can we go to the set of questions that came thereafter?
Sure, please.
Okay. So there was a question on what is EIA and how, I mean, if there are any best practice examples on this. So the point is that, yes, we are a developing country with not much resources to speak for in comparison to countries that are touted as like really good environmental practitioners like Norway and all that. But the point is, this is where the performance index ranked us low with regard to innovative solutions for sustainable growth. I mean, this is where innovation comes into play. That's one. The second point is about resources. We have a lot of laws, we have a lot of funds which are at the disposal of various departments, various ministries. The problem here is of interdepartmental, interministerial coordination. Nobody speaks to each other. They work in silos, and there are many best practice examples within our country, inside villages, inside forest villages, where communities have gotten together with the help of the forest department, with the help of other environment departments. They've pooled resources to improve that area. So we don't really need to go look outside. There are a lot of such great examples within our country. In fact, the Forest Rights Act came into play also to recognize certain traditional practices of conservation by tribal communities so that they can continue conserving in their traditional manner. And so we just need to look at those examples, be innovative, think out the box, and make sure that there is a lot of speaking between parties. And I'm sure that we can achieve anything here. We don't really need to look up to those countries. We can certainly take those examples, but we have good examples inside our country also. Yeah, that's what I have to say on these questions. If anybody else wants to.
A couple of things that came to my mind on, particularly Dr. Ria's two questions, fantastic on, are there large populous emerging economies that we can learn from? I think there are lessons to be learned from both Brazil, China. There are lessons to be picked up from countries like Indonesia. Everything doesn't fit our ball. Say Brazil, the case of higher level of urbanization, leaving the Amazon forest actually vacant to fires, has caused a challenge of its own. China's own, how would I say, temporarily suspended animation of environmental norms till it is ready to acquire them is perhaps what Srinath referred to as differentiation, and we can think of doing those in a more transparent fashion than as a democracy. I think the difference is that China, unlike China, we are a functional democracy, and we should pursue, and the principles of a functional democracy should supersede all other concerns, because that ensures a certain degree of equity of different stakeholders coming together and arguing for the same piece of land or resource. Does the fact that environment falls in an ambiguous plate between the center and the state on the constitution create a challenge? It does, and it doesn't in some way. I think if you see the Environment Protection Act, it does lay out a differentiated role for the state and the center. That needs to change because a larger expenditure is now being made by the states than by the center. But it cannot be where the structure right now is the center says, any project above 500 crores as an example, I will make the money, everything below 500 crores, you will make the money out of it. If it's a process of saying the rules are transparent, but the regulation is decentralized and it's still transparent to the community, that will make a difference, which we've not had in a long while. I think governments in the name of decentralized have handed out licenses and discretion to its state friends, but it's not handed out regulatory processes legitimately, which brings me to the last question of the sacred groves. I think our panelists referred to it very eloquently. Again, I have no doubts. I come from the Northeast where most of our forests are much better preserved than the rest of the country. There is one reason why our traditional practices to some degree have been protected and we've been able to protect our forests, that the control over these resources have remained much more in the hands of the citizens than in the rest of the country. The reasons why you can get away with murder almost in the central Indian tribal belts and you cannot in the Northeast so easily is because society has a greater role in deciding what will happen to our forests. Now, this will not resolve the challenges of urbanization and industrialization. This can still work in preserving your natural resources, but how do you manage when you have an industrial belt coming up in the vicinity of your city? How will you manage that? For that, as a nation state, you have to develop a new model of governance of environmentalism, which may not be based in history, but it can be built on a new civic right of the citizen, which at least the courts and the constitution guarantees. We've not seen in practice, which says, yes, the right to life will negotiate in public with the right to do business. And one will supersede. The right to life will not be subjugated to the right to do business, but a good business shall prevail. Now, you can set these benchmarks to do it better. It will always be negotiated, but it will only be negotiated more fairly if it is done in open sunshine rather than in closed doors of a ministry.
Yes. So someone was asking about EIA, how how public would understand EIA, whether we have resources. So as Shama was pointing it out, that we have best practices, we can definitely take from those lessons. But then it is not about whether we have resources or we don't have. If we don't have enough resources, we can skip this EIA. It is not that. We don't have that choice. It is must. So there was a question, there was even one of the ministers said we must choose between environment and economy. That is not the approach. That is not the right approach. We cannot choose between those two, or the citizens cannot be asked to choose between these two. So whether we have enough resources or not, we will have to take out the resources as creatively as possible and set up a transparent and then EIA, an efficient EIA process. So there is no question whether we have, as a poor country, whether we have a choice or not. And then about the question about the standardization, whether is the new EIA notification actually is transparent. It is, unfortunately, it is not. There is even a clause where the government can classify an industry as strategic and don't, there is no obligation on the part of the government to disclose the details of such industry. So there's this new categorization of strategic industries. So that is problematic and completely against the transparency principles. And then about the environmental philosophy, I was mentioning about the American NEPA paper, but it was just about the principles. So what I told, that there is no document yet. In India, we don't have a document as. Even Nitin was correctly pointing it out that as far as the rural places concerned, we may, there are good practices of this traditional tribal communities and so on that we can actually imbibe on. But then when it comes to city places, we will have to go, we will have to look upon to the constitutional principles and then the modern, the developmental economics as well. So that is what I was trying to say, that we will have to have a regional specific framework, right? It cannot be what is actually applicable to Kerala may not be applicable to Karnataka. Even within Kerala, there is different coastal areas, different hilly areas, and then you have forest areas. That is simply not possible. It is not possible to have a blanket rule or strategy for entire environmental policy. Someone was asking actually, where do we draw a line between environment and economy? We cannot draw a line, straight line. It has to be region specific. So in fact, when it doesn't mean that you will have to limit it to a region, like as it is did in the district is for the objection, it has been limited to a district. I'm not meaning that it has to be limited to district or any region, but I'm saying the principles will have, the framework will have to be evolved. Every panchayat should have their own principle, environmental principle. This has been strongly advocated in the global level. So it might seem impractical, or it might seem too much philosophical at this point of time, but the global powers are moving towards having an environmental philosophy as the baseline for their environmental law regime, which I think we also are capable of having it, and that's the way forward, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you, Maitri. So we began with a question whether how to balance between the development and environment. And through the discussion, I'm pretty sure that everybody would hear is clear, at least at this juncture, that we as a nation stand. It is not a question of there is a position of a balance or something. What we need is not actually what is coming through, which is a very sad fact. But anyhow, we understand that it is not just the deliberations that is required. We need a particular action. And at this moment, we are so happy to announce that we would be taking it upon us as a university to teach the public the importance of EIA and how it has happened in its very technical sense. And the same would be done by our own VC, Professor Nagaraj Nirchal. So, and I think this will lead forward to a better understanding policy within the public, and also the deliberations that we have had has led to a very fruitful discussion. And I'm sure that whoever listens to this would receive a right understanding and a correct understanding on what EIA and its importance. And as Nitin was suggesting, the last nail for us to catch hold on, it is there for us. And our effort shouldn't be restricted with EIA. It should be, as Shama was suggesting, that we need a whole revamping of how environmental laws has been. And the differences that happens right now in judiciary should also be brought together, uniform, and let's build, as Maitri was suggesting, a core environmental philosophy upon which we could actually build a new, a resilient nation and a resilient society. Thank you, everybody. If there is any closing remarks from anyone?
No, just thank you for having us on board.
It was our pleasure, sir. It is our pleasure. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. I at least had a very fruitful discussion, and I hope that was the same for everyone. So thank you all.